Today we're going to do a book review of the book Israelism in Modern Britain by Aidan Cottrell-Boyce. There has not been written a whole lot of books and articles on the subject of the history of the people and movements which have believed that the descendants of the lost in tribes of Israel are the Western nations. And furthermore, the rather few books and articles that have been written on this subject are virtually all of them either for or against this belief. But recently I read this book, Israelism in Modern Britain by Aidan Cottrell-Boyce, published in 2022. And the book is about the history of the people and movements in Britain which have believed and do believe that the British and related peoples are the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And what makes this book unique is that first of all it goes into great details, and second of all that it truly is a book about British Israelism and not a book for or against British Israelism. Aidan Cottrell-Boyce is English and is born in 1987. He completed his PhD in theology at the University of Cambridge and has also been a candidate for the Green Party in Watford, a city on the outskirts of Greater London. Now, the Green Party is a leftist party, so Aidan Cottrell-Boyce can certainly not be accused of being a proponent of British Israelism. But this is also what makes his history of British Israelism credible, because he is an outsider who is not an advocate for British Israelism, and still his book is about British Israelism and not for or against it. Books and articles about British Israelism and related beliefs that also believe that the Western nations are descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel are almost all of them either for or against this belief. In other words, they are therefore biased, and often they are very biased. It's therefore refreshing to read an in-depth history of British Israelism written by an unbiased outsider who doesn't have an axe to grind. Now, this book is only about quote-unquote Israelism in the UK, in Great Britain, so it's not about quote-unquote Israelisms in other countries besides the UK. There are various groups around the world who have different theologies who also believe that the Western nations are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and most of these do not call themselves British Israelites. I can use an example myself. I do believe with most of what British Israelites believe, but I do not consider myself a British Israelite for the simple reason that I'm Danish, I'm from Denmark, and therefore I'm not British. But in this book review I'll use the terms, well, in lack of better words, quote-unquote Israelism and quote-unquote Euro-Israelism, for all those various groups and schools of thought and theologies who believe that the Western European nations and their descendants across the world are Israelites. Origin of British Israelism. Those who do an honest study of the history of British Israelism and related quote-unquote Euro-Israelisms are well aware of the fact that it was started by the Scottish Presbyterian clergyman John Wilson from Ayrshire. I'm not sure I pronounced that right. Ayrshire, or whatever. John Wilson held a series of lectures on the subject in the 1830s and also wrote the book Our Israelitish Origin in 1840. John Wilson's lectures and book started a mass movement of British people who believed that they indeed were Israelites. After the death of John Wilson, the torch of British Israelism was taken up by Edward Hine and Edward Wheeler Bird, also known as Philo-Israel or Philo-Israel. After them, the various British Israel associations united in 1919 into the British Israel World Federation, which is still the flagship organization for British Israelism. Splinter groups have left the British Israel World Federation, and other British Israel groups have been formed independently. And other groups with different theologies have also achieved various degrees of success. The most successful in terms of the number of people who have believed in it would be the American radio evangelist Herbert W. Armstrong, who formed the Worldwide Church of God. Other schools of thought which have picked up this belief are the so-called Anglo-Israelites and the notorious Christian identity movement, and in recent decades some Orthodox Jews and also a larger number of Messianic Jews. Those who write and speak against British Israelism and related beliefs often make the false claim that British Israelism, and by extension other quote-unquote Euro-Israelisms, were started not by John Wilson, but rather by a certain Richard Brothers. This Richard Brothers wrote a book in 1794 where he stated that a minor part of the British people, that is only a minority of the Brits, descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel, but that the British nation as a whole did not descend from Israelites. Richard Brothers also claimed that he was some sort of latter-day Elijah or Messiah ben Joseph, who would lead the British Hebrews to Palestine and set up a kingdom in Jerusalem. Brothers also prophesied of the death of the King of England and the end of the British monarchy. And it was because of this latter claim, the claim that the King of England would die and that the monarchy would end, it was because of this claim that he was locked up in a psychiatric asylum. So he was not locked up because he believed that he was a Hebrew, but because he falsely prophesied of the death of the king and the monarchy. Brothers' books and false claims did not result in any larger number of people believing that the British people were Israelites, so obviously he cannot be said to be the father of British Israelism. And yet many people who write against British Israelism and related beliefs make this false claim. It is therefore nice to read that Aidan Cottrell-Boyce makes it perfectly clear that it indeed was John Wilson who was the father and founder of British Israelism, and not Richard Brothers. So just to make it crystal clear who the founder of British Israelism is, there were several people that we know of before John Wilson who believed in and wrote about more or less the same message as the British Israelites. But these people and their writings did not start or did not result in any popular movements which also believed that British and Westerners were Israelites. Their work did not bear any fruit, but John Wilson's work did. Some of the people that we know of who also believed and wrote that the Western Europeans were of Israel were: number one, the French Huguenot counselor and magistrate Le Loyer, who in 1590 wrote the book The 10 Lost Tribes. And number two, another French Huguenot, Jacques Abadie, who also was a pastor in England and Ireland and wrote a book on the same subject in 1723. And then number three, the Swedish Lutheran pastor Johannes Eurenius, who wrote also a book on the subject entitled Atlantica Orientalis, published in 1751. And then number four, the Englishman Richard Brothers, who wrote about it in 1794. The first three of these men did believe that the Western European nations as nations were Israelitish in their descent, but Richard Brothers only believed that a minority of the Brits and Western European nations were of Israelitish descent. But the common denominator for these four men is that they came, they wrote, and then nothing happened. To paraphrase Julius Caesar's words, quote unquote, I came, I saw, I conquered. John Wilson's preaching and writing was, on the other hand, fruitful. John Wilson preached and wrote, and then the British movement started. Notable British Israelites after John Wilson. As we mentioned, the two most influential proponents of British Israelism in the late 19th century after John Wilson's death were Edward Hine and Edward Wheeler Bird. But there were an abundance of famous and notable Brits who believed in British Israelism. I have studied this subject since 1994, but I've never come across a book that mentions so many Brits who believed in British Israelism as this one. I haven't read it in any book promoting our Israelite origin, and certainly not in any book which is against it. So if you are interested in the history of British Israelism, or if you are interested in the general history of the people who have believed in our Israelite origin, you should get a hold of this book. So just to give some examples of prominent British Israelites mentioned in this book. Some of them I have also come across in other books and lectures concerning this subject, but some of them I had never heard of until I read this book. Admiral Lord John Fisher, he was first Sea Lord in the Royal Navy. And here we see him, Admiral Fisher to the right and Winston Churchill on the left. The picture is from 1913. But in 1919, Admiral Fisher wrote a letter to the Times of London arguing that the headquarters of the newly formed League of Nations should be in Jerusalem and not in Geneva. And here Admiral Fisher wrote that, quote, "The only hypothesis to explain why we win in spite of our incredible blunders is that we are the lost 10 tribes of Israel," unquote. From the Times of London, the 7th of May 1919. Aidan Cottrell-Boyce confirms a claim which I personally have heard many times when I have talked with British Israelites in Britain, and that is that, quote, "There have long been rumours that the crowned heads of Britain were secret supporters of the British-Israel cause," unquote, from page 8. Cottrell-Boyce continues that there is one British king who is no longer a secret British Israelite but a confirmed British Israelite, and that is King George VI, who was the British king from 1937 to 1952. George VI was the father of the late Queen Elizabeth II and the grandfather of the present King Charles III. King George VI was not supposed to be king, but his brother Edward VIII, he abdicated the British throne in order to marry an American commoner. And Edward VIII, his brother, he was also a well-known Nazi sympathizer. Actually, Hitler had a plan that if Germany had succeeded in invading and taking over Britain, then he would get rid of George VI and make Edward VIII a sort of a puppet king, a German puppet king. But before George VIII assumed the throne, his name was Duke Albert Frederick Arthur George of York. Then when he became king, he became George VI. But in 1996, a series of letters from the then Prince Albert, the later George VI, were made public. And in one of these letters from 1922, he wrote that, "I am sure that this British Israelite business is true. I have read a lot about it lately, and everything, no matter how large or small, points to our being the chosen race," unquote. And that's a quote from the Independent from the 6th of April 1996. Princess Alice, the Duchess of Athlone, who lived 1883 to 1981, was the last surviving grandchild of Queen Victoria. For much of her life, Princess Alice was the chief patron of the British Israel movement and attended the annual Congress of the British Israel World Federation for several decades. And here on this photo we have Princess Alice in the middle, and on the left we have Eleanor Roosevelt, and on the right Mrs. Winston Churchill, taken in Canada in 1944. General Sir Walter Walker, Chief of NATO's Northern Command and NATO's Commander-in-Chief of Allied Forces in Northern Europe from 1969 to 1972. So in case of a war with the Soviet Union, General Walker would have become Supreme Commander of all NATO forces in Norway, Denmark and Northern Germany. General Walter Walker was a staunch anti-communist and also a British Israelite. And he was also a prolific writer in British Israel magazines in the 1970s and 1980s. So if World War III had started between 1969 and 1972, the armed forces in my country, Denmark, would have been under the supreme command of a British Israelite general. Lord John Moore Brabazon was an aviation pioneer and a conservative politician. He was the first resident Englishman to make an officially recognized aeroplane flight in England, which took place on May 2nd, 1909. He was also a member of the House of Lords and one of Churchill's cabinet members during World War II. Sir Edward Macmillan Taylor, also known as Teddy Taylor, was a Conservative Member of Parliament and was also a British Israelite and spoke at the British-Israel World Federation in Glasgow in 1976. He was Member of Parliament from 1964 to 2005. Cottrell-Boyce continues to write that the British-Israel movement has always been the strongest in Northern Ireland, among the loyalists who wants to keep Northern Ireland a part of the United Kingdom. And he mentions William Grant, a Member of Parliament, who spoke alongside the British Israel preacher Maxwell Carnson at a meeting in Belfast in 1931. The British Israelite William Grant was both Minister of Security, Minister of Labour and Minister of Health in the government of Northern Ireland. The Member of Parliament Robert Bradford was a Methodist minister and Member of Parliament from 1974 to 1981, as well as a British Israelite. He was assassinated by the IRA. And there's also another Member of Parliament, John Dunlop. He was Member of Parliament from 1974 to 1983 and likewise a British Israelite. Nelson McCausland is cited as the most prominent British Israelite in Northern Ireland. Nelson McCausland was Minister of Culture and Minister of Social Development in the Northern Ireland Parliament. Cottrell-Boyce also mentions Clifford Smith, who besides being a British Israelite was also a pundit on BBC Northern Ireland and a regular columnist in the Belfast Telegraph newspaper. Among other prominent Northern Irish British Israelites, he also mentions the late Pastor Alan Campbell, who was the head of Open Bible Ministries. When I visited Northern Ireland in 2005, I met Pastor Alan Campbell and his congregation and had a wonderful time in Belfast and Northern Ireland. Alan Campbell passed away in 2016. Another well-known British Israelite is the poet Patience Strong, whose real name was Winifred May. She's most known for her poems, most of which were published in the Daily Mirror from the 1940s to 1970s. And this paper is to this day one of the leading English newspapers. Before reading this book, I knew very well about Patience Strong, but Cottrell-Boyce mentions that, quote, many of the poems that Strong published in the pages of the Daily Mirror express definitely British Israelist sentiments, unquote. For example, on page 7 of the Daily Mirror from the 27th of June 1940, Patience Strong wrote the poem entitled Israel, quote, the veil is lifted. Now we know our name, our task, our place. God is working out his purpose through the British race and will set his kingdom up according to the word. Israel must contend with Satan. Let these truths be heard and understood, unquote. Bob Danvers Walker was a top media personality in Britain from the 1940s to 1970s. As Cottrell-Boyce writes, his name is practically forgotten now among Brits and certainly among non-British people, but for several decades his name was familiar to the majority of the British public. He was broadcaster to the British troops on Radio Normandy during the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944. And later he hosted a number of talk shows and game shows, including the British version of Wheel of Fortune and also another game show called Take Your Pick. Danvers Walker was also a staunch British Israelite and spoke at many British Israel meetings. The Welshman George Jeffreys, who lived 1889 to 1962, was one of the leading voices in the Pentecostal awakening in Britain in the 1910s and also founded the Elim Pentecostal Church. George Jeffreys was also a firm British Israelite. This, among other things, caused him to leave the church he had founded and start a new church in 1939. Before his death, George Jeffreys was visited by a 21-year-old German evangelist, Reinhard Bonnke, and passed on his mantle to Bonnke. Reinhard Bonnke, he went on to become one of the most successful evangelists in Africa. British Israel and the Jews. British Israelites' view on the Jews have been quite diverse. According to Cottrell-Boyce, most of the early British Israelites were either pro-Jewish or very pro-Jewish, especially after Britain took Jerusalem from the Turks in 1917 and Palestine became a British protectorate. But after the Jews in Palestine launched a number of terrorist attacks against the British forces in Palestine, which culminated in the proclamation of the Jewish State of Israel in 1948, British Israel attitudes toward the Jews cooled down. Still, according to Boyce, British Israelites have never really been anti-Jewish. There are some people who are not British Israelites but who also believe that the Western nations are Israelites and who are outright anti-Jewish, such as the notorious Christian identity movement in the US. But the British Israelites have a different view on the Jews than those people do. The decline of British Israel in the 1970s. I once talked with a Danish evangelical pastor about our Israelite origin, and he claimed that the reason that British Israelism and the related beliefs in our Israelite origin declined in popularity was because of the founding of the Jewish State of Israel in 1948. And this pastor also happened to be a member of an evangelical Christian Zionist church. But in his book, Cottrell-Boyce writes that the British Israel movement prospered and continued to be a noticeable part of the British mainstream, albeit a French part of the mainstream, until approximately 1970. And that the British Israel movement marked its high point in the 1950s and 1960s. But then from approximately 1970, British Israelism began a decline in popularity and has never reached the same popularity that it had in the late 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. So the claim that British Israelism lost its popularity because of the founding of the Jewish State of Israel, that is incorrect. Teutonists and anti-Teutonists. The British Israelite movement was started by the Scotsman John Wilson, who held a series of lectures on the subject in the 1830s and wrote the book Our Israelitish Origin in 1840. In this book, John Wilson wrote that the Germans were also Israelites, just like the British and Scandinavians. The two most influential British Israelites who succeeded John Wilson were Edward Hine and Edward Wheeler Bird, also known as Philo-Israel. Edward Hine took the extremely different position and claimed that only the British people were the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and that neither Germans nor Scandinavians nor the Dutch nor the French were Israelites. Edward Wheeler Bird took the middle ground position and believed that the lost 10 tribes were to be found in Britain, Scandinavia and the Netherlands, but that the Germans were not Israelites. The British Israelites who saw the Germans as Israelites were called the Teutonists, while the ones who did not view the Germans as Israelites were called anti-Teutonists. Since Germany started to compete with UK to become the dominant power in Europe after the reunification of Germany in 1871, it is the anti-Teutonist school which had dominated British Israelites. After the end of World War II, more British Israelites started to view Germans as Israelites, but as far as I know, most still do not. Is Israelism an excuse for nationalism? An often repeated claim by those who attack British Israelism and related beliefs is that it is simply an excuse for white nationalism or quote-unquote jingoism with biblical sanction. But Aidan Cottrell-Boyce rejects this claim and writes that Israelism is not an excuse for nationalism or for promoting imperialism when Britain had an empire. Rather, he says that Israelism is something called Allo-Semitism. Then you're probably asking, what is Allo-Semitism? And I certainly did when I read this book. But Allo-Semitism, it means that you mirror yourself in the Jewish people and see yourself as living a parallel existence with the Jews, but not replacing the Jews. Cottrell-Boyce writes that because British Israelites are Allo-Semitic, they view themselves and the lost 10 tribes of Israel as living a parallel existence with the Jews and not superseding or replacing the Jews as Israel. Cottrell-Boyce also writes that anti-Semitism also explains why British Israelites can both have certain positive as well as certain negative views of the Jewish people at the same time, because they view themselves as living parallel with the Jewish people, but different than the Jewish people. In other words, they view the Jews as equals but different from themselves. And if you already believe that the Western nations are Israelites, this accusation by opponents probably means nothing to you, because you know that it is a false claim. But it is nice to hear that it indeed is false by an outsider who is neither for or against British Israelism. Conclusion. Aidan Cottrell-Boyce's book is an unexpected, detailed and honest and unbiased look at the world of British Israelism in Britain. It puts to shame some of the false claims of the opponents of British Israelism and related Israelisms. But it also highlights the unfortunate fact that the British Israelite movement in Britain is far less popular than it used to be. This, however, should not just be a cause of concern for Israelites. It should also be recognized as a sign that God's intervention in human affairs is nigh. For example, prior to the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites were in a hopeless situation, but it was just that time when the God of Israel intervened on behalf of his people. And another example is the first 2 decades after the birth of Christ. God's people were more or less reduced to Judah, which was just 1 or 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel, and most of these religious Jews of those days even followed a seriously corrupted version of the law of Moses. Not only were God's people tiny and corrupted at that time, but they were also ruled by pagan Romans. And yet it was at this pretty hopeless time, that God chose to intervene by personally incarnating himself into the Son of Man, Jesus Christ. So the times that we are living in now are both full of godlessness and hopelessness, but this should not just be a cause of concern, it should also be a sign that for God's people that the final end times and the second coming of Christ is on our doorsteps.